Good evening. I'm Larry Temple, and as chairman of the LBJ Foundation, I want to welcome all of you to the presentation tonight of the Lady Bird Johnson Environmental Award. Let me tell you about the award and then about the man who will receive it tonight. Lady Bird Johnson was one of the most impactful environmentalists of the 20th century. With her voice and her actions, she elevated to the general public's consciousness the importance and significance of protection and enhancement of our land, our waterways, our air, our forests and parks, and every facet of the environment. A prominent historian proclaimed that she was one of the three most important environmentalists of the 20th century, along with Theodore Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson himself. The LBJ Foundation established the Lady Bird Johnson Environmental Award to honor the vision and legacy of Mrs. Johnson. The award recognizes outstanding achievements in the preservation, restoration, or improvement of the natural world that embraced Lady Bird Johnson's style, energy, and commitment to her work. One of the purposes or missions of the award is to increase public awareness of the environmental challenges facing our country by highlighting the work of selected individuals, corporations, and nonprofit organizations. Former recipients of the award include Ted Turner, former Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt, former United States Senator John Chafee, and Lawrence Rockefeller. Tonight, we add to the pantheon of illustrious environmentalists the name of Ken Burns. Plainly and simply, Ken Burns is the preeminent filmmaker of our time. The late historian Stephen Ambrose said of his films, "More Americans get their history from Ken Burns than from any other source." Ken's films have won 15 Emmy Awards and 2 Oscar nominations, and he received the coveted Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. Now, there are myriad reasons why Ken Burns has earned and merits the Lady Bird Johnson Environmental Award. I want to focus on only 2. In the fall of 2009, PBS broadcast a program entitled The National Parks, America's Best Idea. Directed and co-produced by Ken, it was written and co-produced by his longtime collaborator, Dayton Duncan. That 6-part series focuses on the ideas and individuals that help propel the parks into existence. Filmed over the course of more than 6 years at some of nature's most spectacular locales, from Acadia to Yosemite, Yellowstone to the Grand Canyon, the Everglades of Florida to the gates of the Arctic in Alaska. The heart of the story is nonetheless a story of people from every conceivable background, rich and poor, famous and unknown, soldiers and scientists, natives and newcomers, idealists, artists, and entrepreneurs, people who were willing to devote themselves to saving some precious portion of the land that they loved, and in doing so reminded their fellow citizens of the full meaning of democracy. Lady Bird Johnson loved and promoted our national park system. I dare say that in her time, she visited more national parks than anyone else that was on the public stage at the time. Like the rest of us, she would have been captivated by Ken's storytelling. In November 2012, PBS broadcast The Dust Bowl, Ken's 2-part series about the worst man-made ecological disaster in American history, in which the frenzied wheat boom of what was called the Great Plow-Up, followed by a decade-long drought during the 1930s, nearly swept away the breadbasket of this nation. Vivid interviews with 26 survivors of those hard times, combined with dramatic photographs and seldom seen movie footage, bring to life the stories of incredible human suffering and equally incredible human perseverance. It also is a morality tale about our relationship to the land that sustains us, a lesson that we ignore at our peril. Ken Burns is the quintessential environmentalist storyteller of our time. He has brought to the living rooms of America the visual lesson of the critical need to protect and preserve all of our environmental assets. Because I had the privilege of knowing her and knowing her passion as an environmentalist, I can tell you with absolute certainty that Mrs. Johnson would have been proud that the Lady Bird Johnson Environmental Award is being presented tonight to Ken Burns. So I ask that you welcome to the stage Mrs. Johnson's two daughters, Lynda Johnson Robb and Luci Baines Johnson, who will now present the Lady Bird Johnson Environmental Award to Ken Burns. Ladies.
Thank you so much. I'm happy that you said that you would mail it. I'm not sure how the TSA would handle that.
That's the best part.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Luci. Thank you, Lynda. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I was a little boy in the early 60s and the mid 60s, and I remember how our country began to pivot when it came to environmental concerns. Many of you here remember that there wasn't a thought given to throwing out whatever garbage you might have out the window of your car. And the highways along the United States were littered in a horrible fashion that most of us overlooked. Today I drove from Houston to Austin, and as I looked out the window and saw fields and fewer billboards, as I do everywhere that I travel in the United States, I think of Lady Bird Johnson. I think of wildflowers, and I think of a commitment that really rearranged the molecules of the citizens of this country to reconsider our relationship to the world around us. We made our national parks film, and it was very, very clear that those of us who are concerned with environmental stewardship are often at a disadvantage. We are a former seaboard collection of colonies that decided that we were going to take this continent and manifest destiny, and we were going to own it. And Americans are an extraordinarily acquisitive group. You know, we look at a beautiful river and we think dam and hydroelectric power. We look at a stand of timber and we think board feet. We look at a beautiful canyon and we wonder what minerals we can extract from it. And yet, a few people over time stopped and thought we ought to save a little bit of that for our posterity. And that has become, from the very beginnings of the United States, an important part of who we also are. And if you think about it, the subtitle of our film, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. America's best idea is the articulation of universal human rights. But you'd be hard-pressed to find something that the United States did after it articulated those rights better than setting aside some of the most beautiful places on our planet for all of us for all time. Remember, for the first time in human history, land was set aside not for kings or the royalty or the very rich, but for everybody in all time. It was a completely unique idea, and it could only have happened in a country like the United States. And Dayton Duncan, my partner on this, as Larry pointed out, and I felt in our bones traveling to those states, from Acadia, where the first light of sunlight hits the United States of America in the morning, to the Hawaii volcanoes, from the gates of the Arctic on the other side of the Arctic Circle to the dry tortugas off the Florida Keys, that the national parks, indeed all of our attempts to set aside land for the enjoyment of others, to sort of perceive what nature was like before, is the Declaration of Independence applied to the landscape. We are obligated to do that, and yet we find ourselves in really challenging times where some of the basic assumptions about what we've even already preserved, not what we wish to preserve in the future, are under assault. In the last few days, it has been usually our presidents that we have counted on, from Abraham Lincoln, who signed the law in the middle of the Civil War in 1864 that set aside Yosemite in California, to U.S. Grant, to, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, and then his fifth cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, and then the remarkable achievements of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, all the way up to President Obama. But now we've been directed that our national monuments can be opened up to mineral exploration, to timber, to other kinds of uses. And we now have to gird ourselves for a long battle. And so for me, accepting this award is both a terrific honor, but also, I think, a challenge to me and to all of us, that if we really do care, that if we really do wish to have vistas like this still around, that we have to do everything we can. This is not, and has never been until now, a partisan issue. Conservatism, the heart of conservatism, is saving what we love best. And another way to think about the value of these parks is, what would it be without them? You know, Yosemite and Zion would be gated communities. The Everglades would be drained, and it would be endless golf courses and tract housing and strip malls. The greatest collection of geothermal features in northwest Wyoming would not be called Yellowstone, but sort of Geyser World. And we would have missed all of these places. Even the Grand Canyon was going to become a uranium mine until Theodore Roosevelt stepped in and declared it a national monument, to the absolute furor of Congress, and protected not the 5,000 acres that one presumed the Antiquities Act would do, but 880,000 acres of the grandest canyon on earth. And I think in that spirit, it might require the rest of us to become a little bit more active, a little bit more muscular, and a little bit more vocal in our support of these saved and sacred spaces. You know, someone... I'm speaking to the choir here, but let's move this message out of here and get to work. There was an observer referring, I believe, in the 19-teens to Denali, Mount McKinley in Alaska, which I've been to 3 times. It's one of the great places I've ever called the tallest mountain on our continent. And he said that seeing that reminded him of his atomic insignificance. And I think, you know, we understand that there's something paradoxically perfect about these natural places that they save, that they do remind us of our insignificance in the larger scheme of things. And yet we are, by the virtue of accepting that, inspirited with that and made larger, just as the egotist in our midst is diminished by his or her self-regard. We are saved by the places we save. And so it's in the spirit that I accept this award. Now, I'm going to show you a brief clip from the series. It's a little bit longer. You know, I joked earlier this afternoon with another film that I'd like to close the doors and show you all 12 hours of the national parks, and we would all then really be inspirited and understand our atomic insignificance, but also realize that we had lots of work to do. But I would want to focus, I think appropriately enough, on the stewardship of Stuart Udall as the Secretary of the Interior, who crossed over the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations. And of course, the glue that held his actions together was, of course, the work of the second president's wife, Lady Bird Johnson. We did a long interview with Secretary Udall. It was really wonderful. He understood things. He loved Theodore Roosevelt. He said one of the greatest things I've ever heard anybody say in terms of describing leadership. He said that Teddy Roosevelt had distance in his eyes. He said that he could see around the curve of the globe and knew what was coming, not just in space, but in time. And I think that we all yearn for the kind of leadership that had that. And we certainly felt that in John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the sort of the goad, the reminder of that was Lady Bird. And after the interview was over, we were taking down the equipment, and Stuart pulled me aside and Dayton aside, and he said, you know, if I ever wanted to get something done, if I ever wanted to add something to the list of national parks or national monuments or all the various designations of the now more than 400 sites of the National Park Service, what I did first is I took Lady Bird there. If she liked it, it got done. And so I sort of feel that I've come full circle tonight. I'm so happy to be with you. Please enjoy this short clip, and thank you so very much for this extraordinary honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mark Updegrove and Ken Burns.
Ken, congratulations on this well-deserved award.
This is amazing. Thank you very much.
Now you can be Atlas anytime you want.
That's
All
right.
you have to do is hold that up. Ken was here a year ago this evening during our civil rights, our Vietnam War summit, when he had a conversation with John Kerry and showed what I think will be a landmark series, or part of a landmark series on Vietnam that will debut on PBS in September, and we'll talk about that later tonight. But welcome back. We are honored to have you, as always. Ken, talk about this series. What was the impetus? Why did you want to make this film?
You know, it's funny. We've made a lot of films out in the West. I always gravitate to a moment when we were making a film about Mark Twain, and we interviewed a writer, Russell Banks. He lives in the Adirondacks, and he was talking about Mark Twain, and he said that that the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was our Iliad and Odyssey, that though most of the people in America had come from the European tradition, that we had to write our own Iliad and Odyssey because we were dealing with two themes that the Iliad and the Odyssey didn't deal with. That was race and space. That is the physical geography of a democratic people who could move through that space. And of course, the age-old American problem, which is you articulate universal freedoms in a Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, but oops, the guy who wrote it owned more than 100 human beings. And so Twain alone among the writers was dealing with that. And I suddenly, when he said that, I realized, oh my goodness, almost all my films are in one of those buckets or another. And, you know, we can talk about race certainly as a central theme in America, but the sheer vastness and physicality of this country has always appealed to me. And my longtime producing partner, Dayton Duncan, and I have been out making a history of the West, making a history of Lewis and Clark, doing the Mark Twain parts of his biography that involve that, and have spent a lot of wonderful time out in particularly the Western United States, just drinking in landscape. I mean, I know nothing that I love more than being on a road I've never been on before, you know, and I just love seeing a vista that I haven't seen, wherever it might be. And Dayton and I had talked about various projects, and he, for almost 10 years, was trying to sell me on a project that would take us back to the West, a humorous story called Horatio's Drive about the first cross-country automobile trip. And it literally took him 10 years for me to go, okay, let's do it. And after we were well into that, he said, you know what, I was thinking we should do something on the national parks. I said, yes. And I mean, it was like literally, and you know, 10 years later, we were done. And it was just a valentine to the beauty of our continent, a kind of call I mean, most stuff we see on TV is a nature film, right? Or it's a recommendation of which lodge or inn to stay at. But we were, interested, as Larry said, in the ideas and the individuals that made this American thing happen. The park idea, which is evolving. It begins saving the obvious stuff. Spectacular natural sceneries, tall waterfalls at Yosemite, geothermal features at Yellowstone, big redwood trees and things like that. And then it evolves to complex habitats like the Everglades, in which you're interested in protecting species as well. And then you move on to places that aren't just scientific interest or geological interest, but places that have social and political and military interest. And FDR begins adding, battlefields and taking them away from the army and adding them to the Interior Department. I mean, we are the only country in the world that celebrates even the darker chapters. We have places, Washita and Sand Creek on the Great Plains, that actually are Park Service sites that describe massacres of unarmed Indian women and children by U.S. cavalrymen. We have Manzanar, where we interned Japanese Americans unfairly during the Second World War. We have not only beautiful plantations, but the slave cabins of the unpaid workers who made the comfortable life of the plantation owner possible. Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, still an inner city, a working inner city high school, is still a National Park Service site at the same time celebrating the desegregation efforts in the 1950s. Shanksville, PA, which immortalizes the heroic efforts of the people in Flight 93. So I know of no other country in the world that is willing to say, here's our best stuff, and here's what we're not so good at. And that's all under the purview of the National Park Service. And so we're huge, big fans, and we're very interested in doing it. And that was our 10-year labor of love.
You alluded to the challenges we face in today's America, and you mentioned preaching to the converted here. But what can we be doing to ensure that environmentalism is a top priority for government officials?
Well, we were having a conversation about our Vietnam film earlier, and we realized that many of the divisions and the sort of binary responses we have now, where it's my way or the highway, maybe had their seeds in Vietnam. And I think what's happened is that, unfortunately, the love of the land, this is God's creation, has become somehow politicized. And that if you care about that, it means something that you're against. And that's never been the case. We've always had, there's enough room for all that exploitation of the resources that we talked about, of the board feet, of the kilowatts that you can get generated from a dam, of the minerals that can be extracted. Nobody's asking for a paradigm shift. We're asking for simple protections. All of this is overlaid, though, with a completely urgent thing, which has to do with climate change, which is absolutely real. And for somehow that it's become a political football is incredibly sad, because it means that people can take actions that are so dangerous that if we aren't engaged, all of humanity, just not the United States, but we consider ourselves the exceptional example in the world, if we're not leading on that, we are going to face, our children and our grandchildren are going to face grave, grave perils. And I don't think we want the greatest country on earth to go down as the one that was the impediment to the possibility of saving things. And so it's a very complicated story, Mark, and it goes into territory that people don't like to talk about. When you say American history, you think of a political military narrative, a succession of presidential administrations punctuated by wars. But America is also as much about religious freedom and religious tolerance, and that's a harder thing to talk about. Our first sort of national religion is transcendentalism. So you could see that the documents of our founding, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, sponsored great political energy. If anyone's seen the play Hamilton, you know what I'm talking about. But it also sponsored a great deal of religious and spiritual energy. And one of the things that Emerson and the later transcendentalists, that would include Thoreau and then their disciples John Muir and later Stephen Mather, who was an entrepreneur businessman who was responsible for the creation of the National Park Service and was its first Park Service director, is that they found that you could, in the New World, find God easier in cathedrals made in capital and nature than you could in cathedrals made by man, that we did not need to have the formal dogmatic expression that our European tradition, that we would find in nature our salvation. And that has been part of an American, not just spiritual and religious catechism, but a secular one as well. And for a long time, both political parties have bought into that in a very significant way. And I didn't mean to filibuster for so long, but I think it's important to put in context how much this has been something that we all understood. But in the last few years, you have this degradation of tree huggers, and you have this idea that climate change is somehow, if you're concerned about it, you're anti-business. And no one in a million years would suggest that. I mean, now there's all this emphasis on coal. Well, there's something like 65,000 coal jobs. This is not a big deal. Coal's done. And, you know, and it may be like slavery, that someone in 1820 can say slavery is done and it takes another 40 years for it to be done, but it's done. And there are many more jobs to be made, hundreds of thousands, millions of jobs to be made by renewable and sustainable energies. And we've got to do that. And now we're in a double bind because we have places that we now have, that we thought we saved, that we have to go back and save. But then again, it's just like the political liberty, you know? We understood that it required vigilance, that you couldn't just make a country and say everybody was free. You had to kind of work at it with a kind of muscular and active participation in our political process. And so too, if you lose a place, it's lost forever. If you save a place, you're now obligated to continue to save it and pass on to the next generation the impetus, the love of these places. So what I do every summer, I don't know about you guys, that I take my girls out into national parks and I show them so that I know that they'll take their kids out, just as my dad took me out to a national park. And this is a huge passing of the baton that is part of the drama of the survival of our still fragile republic.
I recognize that this question might be like asking you to name your favorite child, but do you have a favorite national park?
I do not have a favorite child. I have 4 beautiful daughters, 34, 30, 12, and 6, and a granddaughter who's 6, the same age as her aunt, and a little boy who's about to turn 3, who my son-in-law said still outnumbered but gaining when he was born. Those are my most important co-productions.
Do you have a favorite national park?
I do, but it's kind of an interesting story. I'll try not to make it as long as I make my stories. When we began this project, I was working on several things, as always, and I was catching up to our crew in Yosemite. And I had confessed to them all that I had never been to a natural national park. I'd been to battle sites for the Civil War, but there are only right now 59, then 58 natural national parks that enjoy the top echelon of protection. Passed by Congress, the president through the Antiquities Act can designate, you know, national monuments and other places. And that's why there are 59 national parks in a system that has over 400 something units. Anyway, I arrive at Yosemite, and if you've ever been to Yosemite, it's flabbergastingly beautiful, and I was just in my jaw looking at that thing. It felt like a backdrop, and I went in, and I kept saying, you know, I've never been to a national park before. And we worked for 3 or 4 days and hiked up past Nevada Falls and Vernal Falls and camped out and just got amazing footage, which is in the film, and I was shooting all the time. And the last night, we had to go back to San Francisco into our busy lives, and I couldn't sleep. And suddenly I realized this was not the first national park I had been to. That it was in 1959, my mother had been dying of cancer for a few years. She would die in 1965, and our family, as you can imagine, was a sad and demoralized place, and attendance at my baseball game were non-existent, and, you know, catch in the backyard equally so. But one Friday afternoon after school, my father picked me up and drove me from Newark, Delaware, he taught at the University of Delaware, to Baltimore, Maryland, where he had grown up, and I slept in his old bed under his chenille bedspread, and he woke me up in the dark. I'd never gotten up in the dark before, and we drove to Front Royal, Virginia. I remembered all of a sudden came rushing back. It was not a repressed memory, it was just forgotten, I guess, in all the stuff that was going on. And we had a tour of a relatively small park, Shenandoah National Park, and I remember everything we did. We drove through tunnels, we scattered deer with his horn. I went through a cloud. I'd never been through a cloud in my life. We just took hikes. I can feel my dad's hand. And what happened at Yosemite is that it awoke that in me. And so I have to say that I think Yosemite is my favorite park, but that also means that so is Shenandoah. And I've now taken, I remember I took my relatively distracted then 14-year-old second daughter Lily down the Skyline Drive trying to recreate what a distracted dad and his young son tried to do as the 1950s came to an end and tragedy overtook our family. And we saw lots of bears, Lily and I.
So let's stay in your childhood for a moment. How did you know you wanted to do this? Bill Stotesbury, the head of KLRU earlier today, called Ken a national treasure, and that is certainly hard to argue. You are a gifted storyteller. How did you know you wanted to do this?
It's funny, my very first image, my very first memory is 2.5, which is awfully young for a little snippet of film in your hard drive. And that was of my dad, who was an anthropologist, but an amateur still photographer, building a darkroom in our basement of a tract house in a development in Newark, Delaware. And I remember playing, I could just have a 1-second film of moving between the stud walls before he put up the masonite that would sheathe in this darkroom. But the next thing is sitting firmly as a little boy in his left hand as his right hand manipulated the tongs in the eerie red light, and that extraordinary alchemy of a plain piece of paper suddenly emerging with an image on it. And so that was one thing. But as I said, all of this time my mom was dying. And when she died a little bit short of my 12th birthday when I was 11, actually 52 years ago tomorrow, my dad had a very strict curfew for me, but he forgave it if there was a movie on TV that even on a school night went till like 1 a.m. in the morning. Or he'd take me out to the Cinema Guild, and sometimes a movie would start at 10 o'clock on a school night. And I'd see old silent films, and I'd see old Hollywood films, and I'd see new French New Wave films. And we would go to first run things together. And for the very first time at home one night, my father cried. And I had never seen my father cry. He hadn't cried when my mother was sick, and he hadn't cried at her funeral. In fact, I'd done a sleepover with a friend. He said, your dad didn't cry at the funeral. And that meant that he'd heard it from his parents. I got that. And I knew that wasn't a good thing. And I saw my dad cry, and I understood completely that movies had provided him a safe harbor, a kind of an emotional outlet in which unexpressed pain could be expressed. And this was a great film called Odd Man Out by Sir Gerald Reed about the Irish Troubles in, the late teens in Ireland. Nothing to do with our situation, but of course everything. And I remember it was several months after my mom died. It was the fall of 65, and I was 12, and I just said, I want to be a filmmaker. And that meant Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford or Howard Hawks. And when I went to Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts in the fall of 71, all of my teachers were social documentary still photographers who reminded me quite correctly of that earlier love of photography and reminded me that what is and what was is as dramatic as anything the human imagination makes up. And I suddenly found myself not wanting to be a Hollywood director, but wanting to be a documentary filmmaker. And the last thing I worked on at Hampshire was a film for a living history museum, Old Sturbridge Village, which is New England's equivalent of colonial Williamsburg. And it's all live shots of the interpreters in costume in this working village. And the last shot is a pan across a painting. And I had no idea that I would never not make history from then on. That was 1974. And, that's, 43 years ago. I have been in American history. And it took me a long time to sort of connect all the dots that I've just told you. And my late father-in-law, who was a psychologist, said to me, I said, I could never remember April 28th, when my mom's death. It's always, the date is approaching, and then I never am present at the day. It's always receding. He said, and I bet you blew out your birthday candles wishing she'd come back. And I said, yeah, how you know? He says, this is the magical thinking of an 11-year-old. What do you think you do for a living? I said, what are you talking about? He said, you wake the dead. You make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and Louis Armstrong come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? He said, go find. And so I have never not been present for my mom's. We went to Ann Arbor, we did a complicated ritual, and we have never not forgotten that date. And it's amazing. That's what I do for a living. It sounds like dime store psychology, but I wake the dead.
That's wonderful. You said something in your remarks earlier. You said, egotists are diminished by their own self-regard. Let me tell you, I have the great good fortune of calling Ken a friend. And if you want a little dose of humility, walk around with Ken Burns. Number one, no one notices you. So that's instant humility. And number two, you are struck by his humility. He treats everyone absolutely equally. And you related an anecdote backstage, which is really interesting. You worked in a record store in your teens, and that taught you something about human nature. Talk about that.
Well, I did. I had a kind of passion for music in the 60s, and there was a record chain called Discount Records, and Ann Arbor had two of them. We moved to Ann Arbor to try to save my mother's life, and it didn't work, but we ended up there in the 60s, which was a pretty good place to be. And I ended up volunteering at a thing, and I finally was so invaluable that they hired me minimum wage, which I think was like $1.25 an hour. and I got good at it, and ended up being, before I went off to college, the sort of assistant manager of it. But I remember early on that I decided that being a good clerk meant that you had to be the same to everybody. And it was something that developed. And even if somebody was rude, or even if somebody was overly friendly, that you could discipline yourself to try to just be the same. And I went off to college and ended up in the same kind of position at a bookstore to help pay for college and put myself through college that way. And I kept up that. And later on, I began to realize that we have to understand there's no communication in this world except among equals. And we created ourselves because we were frustrated with the idea that a family, just by virtue of birth, could control you as a king. And now we live in a country in which we are suffering another tyranny of boldface names, in which we somehow presume, because we see them in newspapers or on celebrity shows, that they're somehow above us. And what I found is that, that's just not true. We then separate ourselves into ordinary and extraordinary. There are no ordinary people. Everybody is extraordinary in some way. Everybody has a story to tell. And so it's been, and I fail all the time. I mean, we're always brought up short. We're all sinners. That you try to, in some way, see this as a level communication. No matter who the person is, no matter how young they are, there's no, people say, this is a dumb question, and you go, watch out, this is probably the best question you're going to get when you're doing Q&A or something like that.
Some of us came to know you for a 1981 film called The Brooklyn Bridge, narrated by the great David McCullough. It was nominated for an Academy Award, and it got great critical acclaim, and it brought you almost instant success as a very young man. What was that like?
Well, it was interesting. I believe I had the greatest gift of anyone who's ever been nominated for an Academy Award. I have lived since 1979. That's 38 years in a tiny little village in New Hampshire, whose center village probably has fewer people than are in this room. And it's very cold in New Hampshire. And I was very poor. In fact, I'd moved to the house that I live in now because I couldn't afford the 5th floor walk-up apartment in New York because they were raising the rent to $325 a month. And I needed to go someplace where I could finish Brooklyn Bridge on my own. And so I moved with my then girlfriend, soon to be my wife, up to this house where the rent was $275 for a house that had more closet space than my apartment. And I was alone at a point. I think Amy was away. But we had an answering machine, a crude one, for our phone, which meant that once a month somebody left a message. And I went off one day, and we heated the house entirely with wood because we couldn't afford oil. And so, as they say in New England, it heats you 3 times: when you cut it, when you carry it, and when you burn it, you know? And so I had left to go off on some errands. I don't remember what it was. And what you do is you stoke up the fire, get it really hot, and then you turn it way down. And hopefully when you get back, you still got some embers that you can rake up and do it without having to start from scratch with crumpled newspaper and kindling and all of that. And I come back at the same time that I notice that the stove has gone out, which is like, damn. I noticed that there are 20 messages on the answering machine. I didn't get 20 messages in the previous year. I start playing them. A couple are hang-ups. One is the AP in Concord, New Hampshire. Please call us. The next one is the AP in Boston. Then it's the Boston Globe. Then it's some more hang-ups. Then it's this guy I knew in LA who said, call me Ken. And he was a guy thinking of distributing Brooklyn Bridge then. And then I got a call and they said, Mr. Burns, this is the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Would you call us back immediately at this number? And I knew what it was, that we had submitted our film and it had been nominated for an Academy Award. And I jumped up and down and I'm yelling. I'd already taken off my coat. I'm just doing this happy dance. And the stove is out and it's February. And the house is really cold. So without putting on gloves, without putting on my coat, I go out to the wood pile and I load myself up, but I'm just totally distracted. I've been nominated for an Academy Award. I hit this patch of ice with this huge thing, both hands, and I go, oh no, I'm falling. And I kind of twist and fall into this sort of mound of soft snow that I'd shoveled up at the last snowfall. And I fell, and I'm still holding on to all the wood. And my shirt has pulled up, and my back is melting the snow, and it's trickling down my pants. And I'm thinking, no other nominee is having this experience. This is a message from God, you know? Take this to heart, you know? And so it was one of the greatest gifts that I have ever had in my life, you know? And I'm just sitting there, you know, I still walk by, I still carry wood in, and I still walk by that, and I think about that moment where, you know, you think you're something, buddy, you know?
So 27 years ago, the Civil War airs, and it brings you to a new level of fame. Not only that, but it really changes documentary filmmaking. Did you expect when you made that film that it would have the impact that it did?
No, completely flabbergasted. I can still remember September 23rd, a Sunday, was when it was first broadcast. And, you know, we'd worked on it. I knew it was a good film, and, you know, it had expanded, and we'd worked so hard, and it was so hard to make, and it was so fraught, and it was done. And I remember I went out to the press tour where twice a year people from the national press, television press, come and they receive all the networks, and PBS has a day or two, and we still do that. And I go out to Pasadena and show the wares. And so we're out there. This time I was in Los Angeles, and the critics said, this is really terrific, but you know, no one's gonna watch it. Steve, it's like, you know, 11 and a half, 12 hours long. It's still photographs. And Steve Bochco has this new a police procedural that's a musical called Cop Rocks. So, and I kind of left going, well, that's too bad. You know, and it turned out to be the highest rated program, still is, in public television history. And people still write me about it. And today is a school day in America, and in PBS estimates somewhere up to 2,500 classrooms. Some part of the Civil War is being shown today, 2,500 different classrooms. Today at funerals and weddings, the Sullivan Ballou letter is being read and Ashokan farewell is being played. And it's not so much me, this is the most important event in American history. Everything that came before it led up to it, and everything since, whether we're aware of it or not, is a consequence of it. And if you see your country in the same sympathetic way that you see the life of another human being, like a close family member or a friend, then it's very clear that the Civil War is the traumatic event in its childhood. And ignore it as we usually do, distort it as we too often do, or just disguise it, it's still there, and it's still operating on us. And so I think we had a curiosity. For a long time, we just buried it and didn't deal with it. The South dealt with it in really good ways. Some of the greatest literature in American history came out of our loss, the Southerners' loss. But it metastasized in pretty toxic ways that we still experience to this day. But the North forgot about it. It went on conquering that continent and forgetting about it. The Republican Party, founded for only one reason, in a schoolroom in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, it had one goal, to end slavery. That was its one thing. Forgot about that and went on to other things after the Civil War. And so we are still, in the thrall of that. And I think a film that was trying to understand both sides and the motivations to try to be fair, to add in an African-American participation that wasn't kind of silent, passive bystanders, but active, dedicated, self-sacrificing soldiers in this intensely personal drama of self-liberation, that this was the story of the emancipation of women and the beginning of that, in a way, of weapons of mass destruction on a scale never seen before, of new leaders yielding from an old aristocratic kind of presidency and generalships into a new modern kind of middle class, often dysfunctional, as Lincoln, a depressive, and Grant, as at times an alcoholic, would represent a kind of real sea change in who we were in every kind of way. I think that touched a nerve. We're curious about where we came from, and it became possible to talk about it in a way that wasn't just the movement of regiments and this armament or that armament, but something else.
You created not only a great film, but an American moment, a moment of introspection for Americans.
You know what? I understand what you're saying, and I really appreciate it, and you are a dear friend, and I think public broadcasting created that moment. I think we yearn for community. As much as we're all independent free agents, we yearn for community. And there are very few places that happens. When that came out, there were basically 3 main networks and a couple of independent channels and a couple of this, PBS, and all of that. Now we have 1,500 channels and an internet of infinite size. We are distracted, and we know in our heart of hearts that all meaning accrues in duration, that the work we're proudest of, the relationships we care the most about, have benefited from our sustained attention, and yet everything is a tweet or a YouTube video of a cat and some yarn, and yet we want the kind of curation that comes in duration. And in fact, Civil War, baseball, jazz, World War II, national parks, everybody said, no one will watch this, and everybody did. That same tens of millions of people, nearly 40 million, watched all of those things despite what the critics said. When the Roosevelts came out, nobody said that. They fully expected that people to come, because we live in an age where we absolutely need to go and not just binge, that's the joking thing, it's just have our sustained attention in something where we're not butterflies flitting from one, flower to another, but something that reflects our humanity, which is our ability to marshal great mental and emotional energies to devote to a book or a long-form film. And so I think public media still permits that to happen, and I think it was the fact that we could all watch it together as a common experience. We knew we were watching it. People have told me that, conventions just stopped their evening activities that week, and people would just go back to their rooms with friends and watch it. They ran out of blank tapes in Washington, D.C. I mean, it's just unheard of for a documentary.
When you did the Civil War, Did you feel pressure to measure up to that work? The next work, and I don't remember what it was, remind me.
I did a little film called Empire of the Air about the men who made radio, but that was a kind of side project as we were doing the baseball series.
So did you feel pressure to measure up to the standard that you set with the Civil War?
Well, the problem is that I've always been, from the very beginning, from Brooklyn Bridge, my hardest critic. And so it's really not about what people like, I'm not going to do another Civil War again, but I've done enough films that are different from that. No, I think we've been harder on ourselves. I haven't been that. And, and I have to say that living in Walpole, New Hampshire, where all your notoriety and celebrity plus 50 cents gets you a cup of coffee, they don't care.
Plus you still have to haul wood.
And I haul wood. And, they're more interested if the next door neighbor lady who's not feeling well, if I shovel her walk, that's a much bigger deal than if I, get an Emmy for this film or that film. And that's the way it should be. And it's a great place to raise kids. And it's also a place where I've collected, dozens of people who work with me, and we can apply our attention. I miss the society of my colleagues in a big city and all the distractions and things that a big city has, but we like the focus of that, and we can always pick up and go to New York or Boston if we need to.
How do you choose a project?
The glib answer, Mark, is they choose me. I mean, I've got like about 100, 50 or 100 ideas, but they're just thoughts. And then, kind of like the lottery with all those bouncing ping pong balls. And then when something drops down to my heart, and says yes, it's like how you pick a friend, something happens and you don't go out with the idea, well, I now have to pick a friend. It just, something happens that way. And that's what it is. There's no game plan. Well, we should do this and do that. I had vowed I'd never do another film about war after the Civil War, and then I forgave that to do World War II. And even before that was done, I said, well, don't go back to that ridiculous never. We're doing Vietnam. And so we did it, and a woman came up whose father had died in Korea or was a Korean vet and died afterwards prematurely, and said, don't forget Korea. And I said, I very consciously jumped over Korea, not because there anything about it, but because Vietnam is that signal thing at the end of the 20th century that has made us who we are in good and bad ways, mostly bad ways, and helped promote the divisions that we all lament. Everybody. Nobody wants to be divided. Everybody wants to be together. Everybody loves singing the national anthem at a baseball game, and nobody has to say, well, did you vote for her or did you vote for him? And, when somebody's, broken down on the side of the road, you don't stop and say, well, I didn't go there because it had that bumper sticker on. We don't do that. I remember there was a wonderful moment in Bozeman, Montana, where some knucklehead threw a rock through the window of a Jewish family that was displaying a menorah at Christmas time or Hanukkah for them. And they immediately sold out of menorahs in Bozeman. I think it was Bozeman. It was some Montana city. It might have been Billings. And the newspaper printed a full-page image of a menorah, and thousands and thousands of Christian families put a menorah up in their front windows. That's who we are as Americans.
I mentioned Ken's Vietnam film, which will debut on PBS in September and is a breathtaking accomplishment. I've asked you this before, but I'm going to ask you again. What did you most learn about Vietnam through that film?
I just think I learned again, as every film reminds us, is that if you think you know something, you don't. Let me go away from Vietnam for a second and just say, if I say the 1920s for you, that may conjure up for you an image. Maybe it's a flapper, maybe it's a type of car, maybe it's a gangster and a machine gun, maybe it's something, I have been through the 1920s on about 10 of my films. And that 1920s is different with each of the films, whether it's baseball or it's jazz or it's Prohibition or the Roosevelts or the national parks. It's a different thing. There are things in common. but it's completely different 20s. And so whatever it is, when we say Vietnam, it might trigger some conventional wisdom, some superficial relationship, maybe some images, maybe some opinions. But that's not the story. And so for us, it's how do you shed what you know in order to invest yourself in what really happened? As we were talking about it earlier in the day, some of the most basic stuff. Ho Chi Minh was not running things. Wouldn't you like to know who was running things? The Gulf of Tonkin is a really complicated event that has to do actually with South Vietnamese aggression against North Vietnamese islands that bring out a tiny North Vietnamese Navy that fires torpedoes at us after we've fired torpedoes at them, that all of a sudden becomes the legitimacy to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that it passes unanimously in the House of Representatives, and only 2 senators in the United States Senate voted against it, and basically gave President Johnson a kind of carte blanche to prosecute the war, or the undeclared war, as he saw fit, and as Kennedy had been doing, and as Richard Nixon would do. I mean, some of the basic stuff, but then it's more also in the intervals and the moments between the expressions on a Gold Star mother's face, a twitch of her cheek as she recalls something. And we have a Gold Star mother who early on just clearly adored her oldest son, who was very bookish and loved history, and she would read to him at night, and she reads to him from, Henry V and St. Crispin's Day speech, and it's basically saying, you don't want to be the person sitting at home hearing the tales. You want to be part of the people who are making the tales. And, we cut not to some medieval castle, but to a helicopter disgorging soldiers in Vietnam, which is where this young boy is going to end up and not come home from. And you could just see on her face. And that's what you want to be receptive to. That's what you want to learn from. It's just like music. They say, people who know about music, it's not the notes, it's actually the intervals between the notes that make it. And in film, it's not the shot, it's the cut between the 2 shots. Because all of a sudden, 1 + 1, one note and another note, don't add up to 2 notes, 2 shots, 1 shot and another shot don't add up to 2 shots. They add up to 3. And that's what we're interested in. That's what we look for in our faith, in our love, in our relationship to nature, in art. When is it that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? So here's the sum of the parts, here's the whole. And we need to spend more time as human beings and Americans asking us, what is that difference? That we're 1 and 1 = 3. And that improbable calculus is actually what all of us want. Not the rational 1 + 1 = 2, but the mysterious, the thing, the atomic insignificance, which paradoxically makes you feel bigger.
Right.
What is that about?
Right.
When you stand on the rim of the Grand Canyon, as John Muir called it, this grand geological library, you can see the layers. The Colorado River has patiently carved that canyon to reveal Precambrian Vishnu schist that is 1.7 billion years old, almost half the age of our planet. I mean, our lifespan becomes, and yet you stand on the rim of the grandest canyon on earth, and man, you feel really, really good. And it's not just what you're looking at, it's whose hand you're holding, right? You got your little daughter or your wife or, your husband or your friend, and it becomes as the historian William Cronin said, a kind of intimate transmission between generations of the love of place, of the love of country, of the love of nature.
We sit, of course, in the library of the 36th president. And you and I have talked about the notion of you taking on Lyndon Johnson.
We're doing it.
As a next project. Is that right? Is it committed?
Not the next project. We are foolishly obsessive, and we've got everything planned out to 2030. And I felt the whole time that I was working on this film on Vietnam, that the unfortunate thing, I'd done the Roosevelts, and here was the #1 disciple of Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who wanted to transform his country in the most beautiful ways with the Great Society. And the accomplishments that he did in civil rights dwarf Lincoln's. the accomplishments he did in helping other people. I mean, it's one of the most successful, second only to the New Deal in terms of successful legislative agendas. And yet there was these off-camera guns. Well, I was making a film for 10 years about putting those guns on camera, where the domestic program was constantly being sort of silenced by those guns and the cost of it and the controversy of it and the opposition to it. And I want to go back and do it from the other way. I want to hear those guns getting louder, but I want to focus on his record, and particularly civil rights. You know, he did more for civil rights than any other person in the United States, period. And this is a white Southerner. Now, John F. Kennedy had no relationship to African Americans. People in the South do, and it's a very complicated dance, and we don't need to go through that. But Kennedy had a come to Jesus moment and understood that this was the coming thing. You know, in our Jackie Robinson film that was out last year, you know, Robinson was voting for Richard Nixon because that's the party of Nixon, the party of Lincoln, and JFK didn't look him in his eye, right? But then Nixon wouldn't campaign in Harlem, and when Martin Luther King was arrested and a judge in Atlanta was sentencing him to a chain gang, which meant death, Nixon said interfering would be grandstanding. But Bobby Kennedy got him released on bail, and Kennedy called Coretta, and that changed everything. So he proposes a civil rights bill that would never get passed by him had he lived. It could only be passed by one person on earth. And that was one person who understood exactly what the stakes would be and the price that would be paid, and he paid the price, but he was able to make the most significant achievements in civil rights since the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th and 14th Amendment.
See, I thought we were going to have to apply the Johnson treatment to get you to do the documentary. I thought that was fully prepared to do.
You mean that? Senator Green backing up.
Ken, you do us great honor by being here. We congratulate you on this award. And I must tell you, and I can speak for every member of this audience, we can't wait for you to take on Lyndon Johnson.
We'll
Thank
give
you
it
so
our
much.
best. Thanks
for being here.
Thank you all.